hives on his property, and he has plans to expand that to 5 or 6 hives this year. He's also well known as a talented photographer of birds. Plus, music is another one of his interests. Some of you may have attended his HASP class movie on movie music earlier this year. So with that, I'll turn the microphone and the camera over to Clay Stauffer, where we'll learn about the collapse of the honeybee populations and what it means to our food supply. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. I just want to thank Amy and everybody here for the chance to do this. When Tom called me originally about doing a talk on honeybees and our food supply, I kind of jumped at the chance because I'd done a presentation for a club I belonged to about 10 years ago on honeybees and what was then called colony collapse disorder. And so I had some of it I'd done some research on it, and then just some practical experience gained from keeping bees, maybe 13 years now. So I want to emphasize that I'm not an entomologist. I don't have a doctoral degree, and I think of myself as more of a guide for you all this morning than an expert. I think the longer you keep bees, the more humble you become, because you keep finding out, well, as we joke, sometimes they don't read the same books we do. And they're just amazing creatures. And this talk, as you'll see, is not entirely about honeybees alone. And we'll discuss some of that. But I just wanted to make sure. Let me look at my notes here. Yeah, so anyway, we're going to focus really on bees and our food supply. And it's like so many topics, it's really complex the more you get into it. But we're going to start off with sort of a familiar trope, if you will. Let me just move this to the next slide, if I can. I seem to be having a problem here with the slide. Moving it to the next slide. I'm going to go ahead while we get Amy in here to look at this. I was sort of thinking about how to get into this topic, and it occurred to me, great, thank you, that the familiar dandelion, which we're starting to see right around now, is maybe one of the best ways to get into this. And the reason I say that is after we didn't have a very tough winter this year, I admit, but after a normal winter, it's really one of the earliest flowers that we see. A very cheerful little humble flower. To some people, it's the bane of their existence when they're trying to cultivate a nice green lawn. But I guess I'm going to argue that we need to reframe how we look at the dandelion and think about the bigger picture here, because for bees, the dandelion is a lifeline. It's one of the first plants, along with maples and some of the early blooming trees, that provides pollen. And pollen is what larvae, baby bees, exist on. It's very high in protein. And as we'll hear from Marla Spivak, it's a really important part of the bee's diet. Not so much for adult bees, because they eat carbohydrates, they eat honey, but for baby bees. So to some people, this is an ugly little flower that they're trying to get rid of, and they spray herbicides on their lawns. And I guess I would argue that we need to reframe that and think about the dandelion in a completely new way. Just a little plug, and I think I'll try to reiterate that as we go on. Okay, honeybees and our food supply. There's a lot of literature out there. Some of it not as current as you might think. There was a landmark study done around the turn of the century on pollination and our food supply. And pollination is really the nexus of what we're going to be talking about here. It's a service that bees of all types, moths, even some bats, various creatures provide incidental to their primary mission, which is collecting food or just moving about. So honeybees, 71 of the 100 most common crops that account for 90% of the food supply are pollinated by honeybees and wild bees, we should add. Honeybees tend to get a lot of attention because there's a long relationship between human beings and honeybees. If you go back in the classical literature, Horace wrote about honeybees in his, I think it's the Georgics. Aristotle wrote about, they didn't always understand about bees. They thought the big bee, the queen bee, as we know now, was actually a king bee. They tended to anthropomorphize in their sort of paternalistic way. But at any rate, the point is that bees and humans have been around for a long time, and they've had a mutually beneficial relationship for the most part. So the figure that you'll keep running across is, and this is again somewhat out of date, commercial beekeeping contributes more than $15 billion to the U.S. economy. But it's not quite that simple, and I think that understates things a lot. So first, I want to reassure you, our food system isn't about to collapse because of honeybee problem. But that's not to say that without bees, honeybees are easily managed bees, without pollination services provided by bees of all kinds, that the quality, the productivity, and the availability, and of course the price of food would not be affected. For instance, I think this is a very good way of putting it. If for some reason we didn't have bees around, there would be all sorts of repercussions. We'd require more land and water to grow the same amount of food. The quality of our food would not be as high. The productivity wouldn't be as high, as I mentioned. We would lose nutritional variety. And it would be a very slippery slope because the more land you put into cultivation, the more water inputs that you require would affect how we live, the price of food, of course. And unfortunately, it would mean that there would probably be a greater reliance on synthetic fertilizers from the petrochemical industry, for instance. So it's in our best interest to look at what's going on with honeybees, wild bees, and agriculture, and consider how we might change things to operate more sustainably. And having said that, I'd like to just say, I know that farmers are under tremendous pressure to increase yields. Farming is a business, and you have inputs, and it's not an easy business. There are a lot, as everybody knows, there are a lot of threats to crops when weather, drought, all sorts of things. But let's focus on pollination. It's an essential step in the reproductive process of the world's nearly 300 species of flowering plants. And interestingly, bees, as a family of insects, emerged in the early to mid-Cretaceous period, maybe 120 million years ago, separated from wasps. And that's a long time. And it really sort of coincides with the growth and the emergence of angiosperms, flowering plants. So it's really important to remember that bees of all kinds and flowering plants have co-evolved together. And the more you look at it, the more you understand that this relationship is just really amazing. Recent research has really uncovered evidence in the bees' neuroanatomy. And this is a very interesting book, by the way, if you're ever interested in learning more about individual bees. It's called The Mind of a Bee. That pollination is a learned process. It's not just an instinctive thing that bees do, although there is that, but there's more to it. And bees actually learn from other bees which plants to pollinate, when to pollinate. So it's a tremendously complex process. So pollination, we're all sort of familiar with the fact that pollination has to travel from the male gamete, male part of the flower rather, to the stigma of another flower. And once that happens, the pollen grain germinates, and then the reproductive process happens. It's just a fact of life and very important. And insects, bees in particular, facilitate this. So it affects our food supply. Insect pollinators are critical to biodiversity. If we didn't have insects out there doing this work, we would have to get the work done somehow. Some plants are wind pollinated, but many of the plants that we like the most, or whose fruits and vegetables we like the most, are pollinated really only effectively by insects. What I'm going to do now, and I hope you don't mind, but I think it's really worthwhile, is Dr. Marla Spivak is a research scientist, and she has spent her adult life researching bees in various topics. But she gave a TED Talk in 2017, and it really does a great job of explaining the situation now. So I'm going to put that on for about 12, 15 minutes. I hope you don't mind, but as I said, I'm not a research entomologist. I'm just a beekeeper, and I'm more of a guide for you than an expert. So I think we'll watch this and then move on after that. Everybody here okay?
This is our life with bees. And this is our life without bees. Bees are the most important pollinators of our fruits and vegetables and flowers and crops like alfalfa hay that feed our farm animals. More than 1/3 of the world's crop production is dependent on bee pollination. But the ironic thing is that bees are not out there pollinating our food intentionally. They're out there because they need to eat. Bees get all of the protein they need in their diet from pollen and all of the carbohydrates they need from nectar. They're flower feeders. And as they move from flower to flower, basically on a shopping trip at the local floral mart, they end up providing this valuable pollination service. In parts of the world where there are no bees or where they plant varieties that are not attractive to bees, people are paid to do the business of pollination by hand. These people are moving pollen from flower to flower with a paintbrush. Now, this business of hand pollination is actually not that uncommon. Tomato growers often pollinate their tomato flowers with a handheld vibrator. Now, this one's the tomato tickler. This is because the pollen within a tomato flower is held very securely within the male part of the flower, the anther. And the only way to release this pollen is to vibrate it. So bumblebees are one of the few kinds of bees in the world that are able to hold on to the flower and vibrate it. And they do this by shaking their flight muscles at a frequency similar to the musical note C. So they vibrate the flower, they sonicate it, and that releases the pollen in this efficient swoosh, and the pollen gathers all over the fuzzy bee's body, and she takes it home as food. Tomato growers now put bumblebee colonies inside the greenhouse to pollinate the tomatoes because they get much more efficient pollination when it's done naturally, and they get better quality tomatoes. So there's other, maybe more personal reasons to care about bees. There's over 20,000 species of bees in the world, and they're absolutely gorgeous. These bees spend the majority of their life cycle hidden in the ground or within a hollow stem, and very few of these beautiful species have evolved highly social behavior like honeybees. Now, honeybees tend to be the charismatic representative for the other 19,900 plus species because there's something about honeybees that draws people into their world. Humans have been drawn to honeybees since early recorded history, mostly to harvest their honey, which is an amazing natural sweetener. I got drawn into the honeybee world completely by a fluke. I was 18 years old and bored, and I picked up a book at the library on bees, and I spent the night reading it. I had never thought about insects living in complex societies. It was like the best of science fiction come true. And even stranger, there were these people, these beekeepers that loved their bees like they were family. And when I put down the book, I knew I had to see this for myself. So I went to work for a commercial beekeeper, a family that owned 2,000 hives of bees in New Mexico, and I was permanently hooked. Honeybees can be considered a superorganism, where the colony is the organism, and it's comprised of 40 to 50,000 individual bee organisms. Now, this society has no central authority. Nobody's in charge. So how they come to collective decisions and how they allocate their tasks and divide their labor, how they communicate where the flowers are, all of their collective social behaviors are mind-blowing. My personal favorite, the one that I've studied for many years, is their system of healthcare. So bees have social healthcare. So in my lab, we study how bees keep themselves healthy. For example, we study hygiene, where some bees are able to locate and weed out sick individuals from the nest, from the colony, and keeps the colony healthy. And more recently, we've been studying resins that bees collect from plants. So bees fly to some plants and they scrape these very, very sticky resins off the leaves, and they take them back to the nest where they cement them into the nest architecture, where we call it propolis. We found that propolis is a natural disinfectant. It's a natural antibiotic. It kills off bacteria and molds and other germs within the colony, and so it bolsters the colony health and their social immunity. Humans have known about the power of propolis since biblical times. We've been harvesting propolis out of bee colonies for human medicine, but we didn't know how good it was for the bees. So honeybees have these remarkable natural defenses that have kept them healthy and thriving for over 50 million years. So 7 years ago, when honeybee colonies were reported to be dying in mass, first in the United States, it was clear that there was something really, really wrong. In our collective conscience, in a really primal way, we know we can't afford to lose bees. So what's going on? Bees are dying from multiple and interacting causes, and I'll go through each of these. The bottom line is bees dying reflects a flowerless landscape and a dysfunctional food system. Now, we have the best data on honeybees, so I'll use them as an example. In the United States, bees, in fact, have been in decline since World War II. We have half the number of managed hives in the United States now compared to 1945. We're down to about 2 million hives of bees, we think. And the reason is, after World War II, we changed our farming practices. We stopped planting cover crops. We stopped planting clover and alfalfa, which are natural fertilizers that fix nitrogen in the soil. And instead, we started using synthetic fertilizers. Clover and alfalfa are highly nutritious food plants for bees. And after World War II, we started using herbicides to kill off the weeds in our farms. Many of these weeds are flowering plants that bees require for their survival. And we started growing larger and larger crop monocultures. Now, we talk about food deserts, places in our cities, neighborhoods that have no grocery stores. The very farms that used to sustain bees are now agricultural food deserts dominated by one or two plant species like corn and soybeans. Since World War II, we have been systematically eliminating many of the flowering plants that bees need for their survival. And these monocultures extend even to crops that are good for bees, like almonds. 50 years ago, beekeepers would take a few colonies, hives of bees, into the almond orchards for pollination, and also because the pollen in an almond blossom is really high in protein. It's really good for bees. Now, the scale of almond monoculture demands that most of our nation's bees, over 1.5 million hives of bees, be transported across the nation to pollinate this one crop. And they're trucked in semi-loads, and they must be trucked out because after bloom, the almond orchards are a vast and flowerless landscape. Bees have been dying over the last 50 years, and we're planting more crops that need them. There has been a 300% increase in crop production that requires bee pollination. And then there's pesticides. After World War II, we started using pesticides on a large scale, and this became necessary because of the monocultures that put out a feast for crop pests. Recently, researchers from Penn State University have started looking at the pesticide residue in the loads of pollen that bees carry home as food. And they've found that every batch of pollen that a honeybee collects has at least 6 detectable pesticides in it. And this includes every class of insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and even inert and unlabeled ingredients that are part of the pesticide formulation that can be more toxic than the active ingredient. This small bee is holding up a large mirror. How much is it going to take to contaminate humans? One of these class of insecticides, the neonicotinoids, is making headlines around the world right now. You've probably heard about it. This is a new class of insecticides. It moves through the plant so that a crop pest, a leaf-eating insect, would take a bite of the plant and get a lethal dose and die. If one of these neonics, we call them, is applied in a high concentration, such as in this ground application, enough of the compound moves through the plant and gets into the pollen and the nectar, where a bee can consume, in this case, a high dose of this neurotoxin that makes the bee twitch and die. In most agricultural settings, on most of our farms, it's only the seed that's coated with the insecticide. And so a smaller concentration moves through the plant and gets into the pollen and nectar. And if a bee consumes this lower dose, either nothing happens or the bee becomes intoxicated and disoriented, and she may not find her way home. And on top of everything else, bees have their own set of diseases and parasites. Public enemy number 1 for bees is this thing. It's called Varroa destructor. It's aptly named. It's this big blood-sucking parasite that compromises the bee's immune system and circulates viruses. Let me put this all together for you. I don't know what it feels like to a bee to have a big blood-sucking parasite running around on it, and I don't know what it feels like to a bee to have a virus. But I do know what it feels like when I have a virus, the flu. And I know how difficult it is for me to get to the grocery store to get good nutrition. But what if I lived in a food desert? And what if I had to travel a long distance to get to the grocery store, and I finally got my weak body out there, and I consumed in my food enough of a pesticide, a neurotoxin, that I couldn't find my way home. And this is what we mean by multiple and interacting causes of death. And it's not just our honeybees. All of our beautiful wild species of bees are at risk, including those tomato pollinating bumblebees. These bees are providing backup for our honeybees. They're providing the pollination insurance alongside our honeybees. We need all of our bees. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do about this big bee bummer that we've created? It turns out it's hopeful. It's hopeful. Every one of you out there can help bees in two very direct and easy ways. Plant bee-friendly flowers and don't contaminate these flowers, this bee food, with pesticides. So go online and search for flowers that are native to your area and plant them. Plant them in a pot on your doorstep. Plant them in your front yard, in your lawns, in your boulevards. Campaign to have them planted in public gardens, community spaces, meadows, set aside farmland. We need a beautiful diversity of flowers that blooms over the entire growing season from spring to fall. We need roadsides seeded in flowers for our bees, but also for migrating butterflies and birds and other wildlife. And we need to think carefully about putting back in cover crops to nourish our soil and nourish our bees. And we need to diversify our farms. We need to plant flowering crop borders and hedgerows to disrupt the agricultural food desert and begin to correct the dysfunctional food system that we've created. So maybe it seems like a really small countermeasure to a big, huge problem, just go plant flowers. But when bees have access to good nutrition, we have access to good nutrition through their pollination services. And when bees have access to good nutrition, they're better able to engage their own natural defenses, their healthcare that they've relied on for millions of years. So the beauty of helping bees this way for me is that every one of us needs to behave a little bit more like a bee society, an insect society, where each of our individual actions can contribute to a grand solution, an emergent property that's much greater than the mere sum of our individual actions. So let the small act of planting flowers and keeping them free of pesticides be the driver of large-scale change. On behalf of the bees, thank you.
Thank you. I just want to note, it occurred to me that our own Outdoor Discovery Center has been, and this is going back a number of years, really instrumental in getting area farmers to plant cover crops and to do other kinds of work, to conservation type work. And I do want to reiterate, I understand farmers are under all sorts of pressure to run their businesses and keep them from going under. So it's not, none of this is an easy, simple kind of problem to solve. But I think we've established that pollination is just a really critical part of our food supply, our agricultural systems. I'm going to call them systems. And that bees of all types are instrumental, critical, essential to this. Honeybees, as Dr. Spivak mentioned, are sort of the poster kids for bees. But all sorts of bees are affected by this because they're all related and they all do similar things. So I'm just going to go through a little bit about pollination. I don't expect you to read this fine print or anything. I just wanted you to see that graphic about how honeybee colonies are managed in the United States. They're moved across the country to serve as pollinators for various crops. And they start off usually in February with the almonds in California. And it's tremendously profitable for beekeepers to truck their colonies out there. And I have a little video I want to play for you about that. And then they'll move from California to the Midwest, perhaps, to pollinate blueberries, down to Florida, all over the place. And this wouldn't happen if honeybees weren't an important part of our system, right? So that's just something to recall. And there is increasingly, as Dr. Spivak mentioned, a shortage of honeybee colonies because it takes a huge part of the commercial beekeeping population, if you will, to get out to California. It's just really quite a feat. So getting back to global food supply, which was our mission here to try to discuss honeybees and our food supply. This is the most recent and authoritative statement that I could find in research. And I think it's conservative. I just have a feeling it is. 5 to 8% of all global crop production will be lost without the pollination services provided by bees of all types. But again, as I mentioned earlier, and then you might say, well, that's not that big a deal, 5 to 8%. We just plant 5 to 8% more land, right? And to make up for that. It's not quite that simple, particularly in other parts of the world, where there's just, that opens up a whole Pandora's box of issues and involving resources and inputs and labor, so that the effect, there's sort of a compounding effect the more you look into it. So I think, as I said, I think that's conservative. But it is reassuring in that if we make some changes, we might be able to improve we could improve our systems. As I mentioned, well, I'd like to just go into wild or native bees now, because they kind of get the short end of the stick. The honeybees are the glamorous ones. But you've seen them in your garden, small little bees. Sometimes they look like flies. It's very hard to, for the untutored amateur to recognize the difference between a certain fly and a certain bee. But and some flies pollinate because they're moving around those plants too. Temperate zones, bees pollinate about 80% of flowering plants. Wild bees are often more efficient pollinators than honeybees, as Dr. Spivak mentioned, and because we all hear the bumblebees, that low droning, buzzing. Well, that's precisely what enables them to pollinate certain plants so well. But there has been an alarming decline in the population of native or wild bees. Between 2006 and 2015, researchers observed a 25% decline worldwide in wild bee species compared with before 1990. Yes. Oh, you've got a mic there. Sorry.
There's a difference between honeybees,
Right.
and wild or native bees.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about what that is? Have the honeybees been
Okay, sure.
sort of domesticated or
I'll
bred
probably
for
get
this?
over my head here, but I'll stop before I do that, because as I say, I'm just a layman with an interest in this. Honeybees, first of all, are social insects along with ants and termites. They've evolved a complex society, a superorganism, if you will. Most wild or native bees are either somewhat social or solitary. In fact, sometimes they're called solitary bees because the female will lay some eggs and provide for a family, the eggs, and then she'll die, and then the eggs will will hatch and the larvae will eat the food there that's been provided for them. So they're not, this sounds, I'm valorizing certain behaviors, but I'm just going to say they're not as highly evolved in some respects as they haven't evolved these social structures. Doesn't mean they're any less valuable or any less legitimate an animal, but and there are 20-odd thousand species of bees, almost all of which are not eusocial or complex, so have social orders, as honeybee. Apis mellifera is what the primary species. And they have all sorts of different types of behaviors, different niches. I'm sure you've had so-called carpenter bees in your eaves, boring little holes into your wood. There are so-called miner bees that dig holes in the ground, nests in the ground. And so they've established all these niches in the world in order to eke out a living. So that's a very rudimentary discussion, but there's some interesting books, and I can steer you in the right way, or up in one direction at least, towards some of those if you're interested in that. With 20,000 species, you can imagine if you're in, your life's work is, you're not going to run out of stuff to study. So to that point, I just found a couple of very attractive posters. One is Eastern North America, one's Western North America. There's going to be a certain amount of overlap, of course, in the Midwest, but you can see there's a tremendous amount of variety. They're so-called halictidae, sweat bees, all sorts of types of bees out there. So, and they are really valuable little creatures that we humans in our hubris tend to ignore or even terrorize. But we need them. We need them out there doing what they do. A brief introduction, because I know we don't have a lot of time, to bees. As we talked about, 20,000 species or more, actually, 20,473. 5,227 are in North America. And this will get to your question, sir, about different types of bees. In Central America, you may know there are species of stingless bees that the ancient Mayans would harvest honey from. So more than 90% of the bee species are solitary. Usually, and the social bees have a fertile female queen who lays eggs, and female workers who lack full reproductive capacity, and male reproductive drones. And of these three classes, the males are, while they're essential, they're the least important. In the day-to-day, they don't really do anything except mate with the queen, period. If they're lucky, maybe once in their life, because in honeybees, the drone dies during that mating process. There are all sorts of issues about and interesting questions, really profound questions about worker bees giving up their reproductive capacity. Is that a display? Is that altruistic behavior, or is it give them an evolutionary advantage? So there are all sorts of really interesting questions if you're philosophically minded. I urge you to get into that because it's really profound. One of the properties of bees that makes them sort of endearing is their fuzziness. Turns out this is not just to amuse humans, but because there's actually electrostatic charge that develops and helps them do their pollination work and collect. And there may be other reasons for that as well that certainly that I don't know about, or maybe remain to be discovered. Eusociality, I guess, can be defined by three main characteristics: cooperative care of young, and I'll get to that in a second, reproductive division of labor, also in a second I'll get to, and overlapping generations, which a lot of wild or native bees don't really have overlapping generations. They'll one generation, they'll lay some eggs, they'll provide for them in various ways, and then they die off for the season. There are, depending on how you define it, 7 to 11 species of honeybee, and then various subspecies. But generally, when we talk about honeybees, we're talking about Apis mellifera, which is the familiar honeybee that we all see around wherever we are. I don't expect you to read any of this because I know it's hard to read, but the whole point of doing this was to show you that depending on the age of a particular bee, worker bee, I should say, they take care of various tasks in the hive, and they start off in the hive cleaning cells or feeding larvae, and eventually they'll end up later in their life as foraging bees. And people often ask me, well, how long do bees live? Well, in the summer, a worker bee will live about a month, about 30 days. The bees that are born, say, in August or September, will live through the winter, and they actually have a different, somewhat different physiology. They have a higher fat content, and there are other things that set them apart. No, they don't hibernate, and people ask me that, how do you get them through the winter? Turns out, and again, I'm sure an entomologist would probably shudder at me saying this, they're kind of like penguins. They gather in what's called a cluster, and the colder it gets, the closer they huddle together with the queen at the center, because the queen needs to be, to safeguard her eggs and reproductive capacity, she needs to be as close to 94 degrees as possible. So they just huddle together and they shiver to create body heat. And ideally, they'll move in this cluster through the hive on the comb where they've stored honey. What can happen is if it's cold enough and there isn't enough honey, they'll either run out of honey or they won't be able to move to a new source of honey, and then they'll die. So it's a precarious, it's a pretty amazing story that entomologists believed that honeybees, or bees rather, emerged in what was called Gondwana land, eons ago, before the continents separated, or most of the continents, in a dry, warm climate. And the fact that they've been able to survive over the winter in temperate climates like ours is pretty amazing. But anyway, there are your three types of bees. The queen, despite her name, does not issue orders, and she's not really in charge. Just how decisions are made in a hive is, again, a really profound topic. And there's a researcher, a professor at Cornell University named Thomas Seeley, who has written a really amazing book that I recommend to people called Honeybee Democracy. And it's about decision-making in a honeybee colony and how bees arrive at collective decisions, because the way bees reproduce the superorganism is by swarming. And that's when about 40% of the bees in a colony, worker bees, and a queen, the existing queen, fly off en masse to find another abode. And but they don't just, it's a complex process. They'll fly to an intermediate point say, the limb of a tree, or else maybe the hood of your car or some inconvenient place, and they hang out there as a cluster, scaring people because, honeybees. And what they're doing while they're at this intermediate location is deciding where they're going to settle. And they actually send out scouts to various locations. And this is in Seeley's, I mean, he's an amazing researcher. So I'm not just making this up. They will actually go into various cavities, let's say a cavity in a tree, and the bees will walk around and they'll be observing how big is this space? Does it seem like it's about the right size? And they actually have a preferred size. They have a preferred distance above the ground, which is about 15 feet, as I recall. And then they'll go back to the group and report to the group. And then they'll decide on a place to go. Sometimes they aren't able to decide, and they'll just stay where they are. They'll build comb there, and then they'll die if it's in a place like Michigan, they'll die in the winter if there isn't some intervention. So anyway, extraordinarily interesting process. Getting back to the food supply, what Dr. Spivak was talking about, referring to, is the way our agricultural system has changed. In 1900, roughly 6 of every 10 Americans lived in rural areas. Farm population was almost 30 million, 38% of the labor force. Number of farms was 5.74 million. I bet a lot of people in this room had grandparents or great-grandparents who were farmers. And including, a century later, in the turn of the century to 2000, the U.S. farm population was a little less than 3 million and 2.6% of the workforce. Average farm size has tripled. So the upshot of that, the good thing is that we've got an amazing, you go to the grocery store, you go to Myers or Family Fare or wherever, D&W, there's an amazing amount of food for sale there, of various types and so forth, and we talk about that. But in fact, our grandparents would probably be dumbfounded, great-grandparents, I should say, maybe, to see this. But there has been I don't want to be loaded about this. This has happened at a certain cost, and I don't think anybody is advocating that we return to 1886 or something, when most of us lived on farms. But I think there are some changes that arguably need to be made. This is a detailed study done around the turn of the century on the role of honeybee colonies in crop pollination by type. And again, I don't expect you to read it. If you can, that's great. Really, the point is to illustrate, if you certain crops, almonds, they're essential to a good almond crop. That's why almond farmers, they're not renting these bee colonies out of any kind of altruistic sense. They're doing it because they get such great nuts as a result. Apples, blueberries, I'm sure you've driven by our blueberry farms and seen a few beehives. If you look around, you'll usually, coming up pretty soon, you'll see a couple of beehives at the corner of a blueberry farm or someplace there. Sometimes they're hard to find because they don't necessarily want people to see them, but very important pollination. And this is even smaller, and I'm sorry, I apologize, but it's just to talk about that there has been a lot of study done on this. And here's a quotation from a bioscience article from 2006, the economic value of ecological services provided by insects, not just honeybees, but insects. We estimate the value of these insect services we address dung burial, pest control, pollination, wildlife nutrition to be almost $60 billion a year in the United States, which is only a fraction of the value of all the services insects provide. So I think this is getting closer to maybe an accurate estimation of insect services, which are we tend to take for granted. And again, another quotation from this article. And if you want any of these citations to look at, I'd be happy to share them with you. I put them in small type just because they're not the most important thing, but I'm happy to share them with you. What the evidence does indicate, however, is a steady decline in these beneficial insects associated with an overall decline in biodiversity, accompanied by localized severe declines in environments heavily degraded by human impacts. What Dr. Spivak was talking about, these food deserts. Yes. Bees' role, the question is about bees' role in marijuana crops. I don't know anything about that. And I don't even know how marijuana plants, if they're wind pollinated or insect pollinated. And I don't know whether marijuana honey what that would be like. Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm going to look into that.
Question,
All sorts of questions.
how
Good
about our,
question, though. Good question.
Clay, how about our beloved tulips? Are they attractive to bees? And do they pollinate the tulips?
Tom, you're uncanny. I was thinking about that driving in because yesterday I was walking around downtown and I noticed all the tulips were up. Beautiful. Of course, tulip time isn't here yet, right? I have not seen a lot of bees on tulips, but that's anecdotal. So I would have to get back to you on that, to be honest. I do see the bees early in the spring. I think they'll go for any pollen they can get. In a crocus, for instance, like a tulip, right? Daffodil. I think they'll go for that, just because they store pollen over the winter. But if you go up to a beehive entrance and watch bees coming in early in the spring, you'll see their pollen baskets, which are those their hind legs, is where they store pollen for the trip back to the hive. And you'll see very brightly colored pollen baskets. Yes.
Are there variable prime times for different plants to be the good pollinating?
If I understand your question is, are there certain times when there are more plants to be pollinated than others? Is that what you're asking?
Well, does each plant have its type of plant, have its own prime season or prime time pollination?
I think to a certain extent, yes. I mean, we have an overall growing season, and then different plants have sort of slices that are overlapping. That's more a question for, say, a master gardener, but I think the answer to that would be yes. I do know that once you get into the late summer, there's beekeepers have what they call nectar flows or honey flows, which is when if you put a super on a hive, and a super is a box with frames for honeys to fill with, or for bees to fill with honey, certain times of the summer, certain periods, certain plants will be in bloom. For instance, black locust often is a good honey plant, or certainly clover is sweet clover, so-called Dutch clover, white clover. That's a really important honey plant. Whenever those are in bloom, you know the bees are out there collecting clover nectar. So the answer is yes, I think, to your question. But yes, Sandy. No, there's reason I'm smiling is if you keep bees for any number of years in this climate, even though the winters are getting milder, you'll lose some colonies over the winter, and we'll get into some of the reasons why. But let's just talk now about the climate, about the cold. So that's happened to me, and you just feel terrible because you feel you have let I suppose it's like, in a small way, losing a cow or a bull or, some livestock. You feel you've let them down, and I guess you sort of have, because you engage in this sort of informal contract. You'll be my livestock and I'll be your caretaker. Anyway, enough said about that. What I do, which is a little bit of overkill. Well, the first thing you have to do is make sure they have enough honey. And in this climate, traditionally, beekeepers have said you need about 90 to 100 pounds. A colony needs about 90 to 100 pounds of honey to be sure that they'll make it through the entire winter. Certain winters are milder. Certain winters are more severe, but that's just a rough rule of thumb. So you got to have, they have to have the stores, and a lot of beekeepers just kind of lift the hive, and that's one informal measure, or inspect the hive, see how many frames of honey they have. And this is just for the bees. Then what you have to do is make sure that there's adequate ventilation in the hive, because bees, as we discussed briefly, do not hibernate, and they metabolize honey to keep warm. And so when they metabolize this honey, they give off water vapor. And if that water vapor condenses in the hive and then drips down on the bees, that's really deadly to bees. That will kill them. So you have to make sure there's ventilation. And some beekeepers, like I give them extra emergency food. I put it's sort of like a tray, so to speak, with a screen on the bottom of sugar, so that if they were to run out of honey or somehow need some, or sugar, they can get this cake of sugar, which is softened by their water vapor that they put off. And then above that, I put what's called, some beekeepers call it a quilt box. It's basically a box with a little chimney, so to speak, filled with some wood shavings. Now, if you're a commercial beekeeper, you can't really do this. It's just too time consuming. I mean, if you could do it for maybe 5 or 10 colonies, but so what a lot of beekeepers do, if you're a so-called sideliner, which means you maybe have 15 to 30 or 50 hives, they might truck them down to Georgia or Florida for the winter. And I don't know what the break-even point is on that, what makes that economical. But if you're a beekeeper who's just here and you want to keep your bees, you really need to do the things that I described. You might not need a quilt box. You might not need to wrap the beehive in roofing paper, which is something that I often do. But you need to help them get through the winter. And then we'll bring up pests. You need to treat the bees for mites, and I'll go into the mites. I don't want to give that short shrift, because if you don't treat the bees for mites, the colony will die. It's pretty much established that. I'm going to go on here, since you had the question on that, and then we'll come back to some other things. Okay, so threats to bees. We talked about wild bees and how important they are. We don't want to give them short shrift. Let's talk about threats to honeybees, since we've established that bee health is essential to our food system. I think we can all agree on that. One of the biggest threat to honeybee health is the parasite Varroa destructor. It's a type of mite. So it's not actually an insect. It's related. It's a type of tick, really. And these ticks mites came to the United States, started appearing in the mid to late 80s, and now virtually every, I think I have no, I've got another map here or some charts. Yeah. The mite now is just a fact of life for beekeepers. There's nothing you have to deal with it, and there are various ways of dealing with it. This chart or this illustration goes from 2015 to 2018. The darker shades indicate distribution of varroa mite infestations. And if you just look at Michigan, you can see that in 2015, I think this is all self-reported, but 1.16% of bee colonies were reported to have mites. By 2018, it was 35%. And as I say, this is all self-reported by beekeepers who sample their colonies. And there's a way you can sample like 100 honeybees to see if there are mites on them and then extrapolate the infestation level. The whole point of showing you this is to say it's pretty much universal now. You have to, if you're going to keep your try to keep your colony alive, you have to deal with mites. How do you get rid of them? They're really kind of divided into hard and soft ways of doing it. The so-called soft ways of doing it are you can use what's called a screen bottom board, which theoretically helps because mites will fall off the bees and fall through the screen. That's a help. It's not going to save a colony. You can use certain so, for instance, one of the things I do, the way I do it is I use what's called thymol, which is the essence of thyme, very, very concentrated. And that, it's a gel that you put on the hive. I do it in like August. And that will help with mites that are phoretic, that is on bees. But it won't do anything for the mites that are actually in the cells. And I can go into the life cycle of a mite, but which is there. So you can use soft chemicals, thymol, formic acid, oxalic acid, and you can do this either by, for instance, you can vaporize the oxalic acid so it goes through the hive and kills mites that are on bees. And then there are hard compounds, basically miticides, type of pesticide, amitraz, fluvalinate, humifos. And these are really effective, but there are a couple of problems. One is they end up in the wax because chemically the wax is a fat, it's a lipid, and the chemicals want to attach to these fat molecules, and then that builds up and the mites can develop a resistance. So it's not an easy thing. In terms of management, you can interrupt the brood cycle either intentionally or sometimes the brood cycle will be interrupted because of the bees swarm. Something happens to the queen, which is a whole nother topic. And the bees can replace the queen, but it takes a good 3 weeks or more, maybe closer to a month, for a new queen, for the bees to produce a new queen and get it to start laying. Because if we go back to this, the queen's life cycle from the time an egg is laid till she emerges is 16 days. But when she emerges, she needs to mate with a number of drones before she can lay viable eggs. And that could take 5 days could take 7 days depending on the weather, right? So by the time she's actually up and running as a new queen, and that has interrupted the brood cycle. And since the varroa mites are obligate parasites, they have to feed on something in order to survive. So it does put a dent in the varroa mites population. There's been a lot of work on breeding resistance to mites, so-called hygienic behaviors, and Dr. Spivak has been instrumental in this. Breeding bees to groom themselves to get rid of these mites, because then they can chew the legs off the mite and get rid of them. And if you can breed bees to do this, that tends to help them. And there have been lines of bees developed that do this. I don't get the sense that it's been helpful, but it hasn't been a cure, for instance. There's been some interesting research done on RNA interference, so that when bees, if you gave bees sugar syrup with particular genetic material in there, when the parasites feed on the bees, they ingest this and it disables the bees or the mites' reproductive capacity. And who knows, that could happen, but then we're back to the old issue of genetically modified organisms. And is that a good idea? What other things could happen? So the varroa mite was a huge game changer. When I was in high school or elementary school, really, I did a science project on honeybees, which is how I got interested in bees. And it's hard to imagine that back then we didn't have varroa mites. The worst pest that we had was the wax moth, which was a huge problem 100 or more years ago when it first appeared. But compared with the varroa mite, the wax moth is the least of our worries, right? So then there's another parasite called small hive beetle, which in the South in particular is a real problem. And again, they're just small hive beetles. These insects are they adapt and evolve at a high rate, and we can't really go into all that, but they're a difficult parasite as well, particularly if you have a colony that's not doing well. So beekeepers have to put up with all this. What commercial beekeepers do is they will introduce new queens into their colonies routinely and often in order to break the brood cycle, make sure the colony is strong. Yes.
Why does New Zealand have the only source of Manuka honey, and what's different about that?
Oh, okay. That's a big topic. Manuka is a particular plant that grows in New Zealand, and I don't know a lot about it. Other than I like Manuka honey. It has reportedly has a lot of health benefits. So there are only so many Manuka plants, and they only grow in New Zealand. So that's kind of the reason it's so expensive. And it depends. They grade the honey in terms of the concentration of substances that are purportedly beneficial. Yeah, right. I want to move on, just if we could, because the threats to bees really are often described as 3 or 4 Ps. Parasites, we talked about varroa mite. We talked a little bit about pesticides, and I want to talk about that a little bit because it's really important. And what Dr. Spivak talked about, the sublethal doses. In other words, when chemical manufacturers and researchers figure out these compounds. And the neonicotinoids were designed to be safer insecticides, right? The seeds are coated, so it's very targeted. It's just on a plant. There's not as much spraying. So in a lot of ways, it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, it's not some diabolical plot. But what happens is they use, these seeds are coated with various neonicotinoid compounds. But farmers, when they're planting corn, which is wind pollinated, but we can get to that in a second, they use a talc-like substance to help the seeds go through the planting machines. And this talc becomes contaminated, highly contaminated with neonicotinoid pesticide. And the bees confuse this talc with pollen because it looks just like pollen. It acts just like pollen. And so that's one avenue that is difficult. The other route that Dr. Spivak mentioned was the entire plant then becomes toxic, which can be a problem, right? And it's the sublethal doses and the synergy between the so-called inactive ingredients in a pesticide and the active ingredients. I mean, we all focus on the active ingredient, which is a neurotoxin, but it turns out that a lot of the inactive ingredients operate in ways that were not clearly understood and are toxic to bees. And what happens is bees lose cognitive ability. And it turns out that bees, and again, I'm going to just plug this book for whatever it's worth, The Mind of a Bee. The researcher is professor of sensory and behavioral ecology at Queen Mary University in London, Britain. He's not just some crackpot. He knows what he's talking about. It's a fascinating book. Anyway, bees lose cognitive ability. And that is enough to really affect the fate of a colony because there's cooperative caregiving, there's navigation. Bees navigate by observing the sun. They can see polarized light, and that's how on a cloudy day, they know exactly where the sun is. So these so-called sublethal doses in the laboratory testings, they may say, well, the LDL equals 50, that's lethal dose, 50% of the honeybees is X. So then we're going to base our dosage and information on that. It's not the whole story. And as Dr. Spivak mentioned, pesticides are showing up in bee pollen and wax, so that the bees are bringing these toxic substances, and how they interact is a really if you have 98 substances in pollen, in what particular pollen sample, you can see the complexity of trying to figure out, well, how are these interactions happening? What could possibly happen and what amounts and so forth. So it's really a complicated topic, but something's going on. So pesticides, huge issue. And we live in an area where corn and soybeans are dominant crops. And in the Midwest, there's just a lot of agriculture is dependent on pesticides, as it is, I guess, throughout the country. But now, the fact is, varroa mites spread disease, and these are some of the pathogens or disease-causing organisms that it used to be that beekeepers knew about European foul brood and American foul brood and nosema, but now there are these other viruses that are coming into that may have been around, maybe some of them, but beekeepers didn't know about them.
I have a question.
Okay,
Over here.
yeah, we probably
You
need to,
said you have 3 colonies, or
right.
do you sell your honey, or just?
I
You're
do.
a
I used to
honey
sell it.
farmer in a way.
Now I just kind of give it away. I used to have more colonies. I think the most I had was 7. But that's a lot of work, and
Yeah.
the older I get, sort of the lazier I get.
So you basically give it to friends and that kind of thing.
Right.
When you harvest the honey.
Right, right.
Okay.
Um,
Any other questions here on this slide?
yes.
Oh, sorry. Wondering about the healthcare of the bees, and you
Okay.
have your own colonies. Would you think that your colonies are healthier than the bees that are trucked across the country to, migrate across the country to pollinate something out in, the almonds somewhere? Because I think you mentioned that sometimes the ones that are trucked around the country aren't given the best nutrition. So I was just curious.
Well, that's a really loaded question, because it would be, you'd have to do a really scientific study with control groups and so forth to find out are my bees, and it would depend on my skill, because I tend to sometimes give my bees sort of benign neglect. If everything seems to be okay and there's a queen laying eggs, I kind of tend to just leave it alone, and I take off some honey in July, but the rest of the summer, they get all the honey that they can harvest. So without sort of getting my part into it, I think bees that stay in one good location, and mine are out near that Macatawa natural area where they have a lot of wild forage, I think they are healthier. And what I was going to get into was traditionally, or at least the last 20 to 30 years, what a lot of beekeepers have done when they're finished trucking their bees around for pollination, they'll take them up into South Dakota or North Dakota. And some beekeepers say they kind of detox there because they're out in the grassland. There's a program called Conservation Reserve Program. And it's been a popular program where the federal government, in effect, says to farmers, if you take your land out of production and just let it be fallow, we'll support that. And it's been really beneficial for wildlife and for, bees. It wasn't done to help bees at all. It was, that's not the purpose, but it enabled, it gave beekeepers a place to put bees to, just coincidentally, to sort of detox from all when they're out in the almonds. And I was going to play a clip, but we ran out of time. Some nearby growers might spray some fungicides while the bees are out foraging in almonds. It could drift. If you're spraying, obviously it's not going to just stop magically at the property line. Or sometimes even almond groves, knowing that the fungicide won't be instantly lethal, will spray fungicides while bees are actively foraging. And then they might spray it the day before bees show up, in which case there's still an active fungicide or insecticide on the plant. So it's a complicated thing. And I'd have to say yes. I mean, not out of anything that I've done, but just because there's a price to be paid for moving these bees around. And these beekeepers are tremendously skilled and they know what they're doing. And if you have 1,000 colonies or 2,000 and you're trucking them from Idaho to the Central Valleys of California, I mean, it's quite a project. And I want to plug this film. I think this is available either, you can stream it on one of the streaming services, whichever ones you like or use, called The Pollinators. And I really recommend that because that'll give you a sense of the scope that we're dealing with here. Yes. Okay.
I was recently told that if I ate or took a teaspoon of locally grown honey, not the.
Right.
that we craft,
Yeah.
locally grown honey, that it would provide an immunity to allergies.
I, I've, a lot of people swear by that, and there's an entomologist in Kalamazoo, a really internationally known entomologist, Larry Connor, and he's a really great guy and everything. Anyway, I think he's retired, but maybe not. He's written a number of books. Anyway, point of bringing him up is to say, when he gets asked that, he says, just let people decide if it works. And I think there very well may be something to that. Certainly is not going to hurt you. And again, you could maybe even do some research on your own and try to find out if there have been any really peer-reviewed studies that are authoritative about that. I would do it. I do it with my own honey. So I don't know. I don't necessarily do it for the health benefit, but it certainly could be the case. Yes. Sure. Actually, that you reminded me, ma'am, when you had that question of something I wanted to say, which is, since I'm such small potatoes, I'm just a small little hobby beekeeper. And by the way, there are a number of beekeepers in the area. There's a bee club. If you're interested in this, you could go to one of the meetings. Honey production process. Okay, like everything else, you go from the backyard guy like me to an industrial scale. I happen to basically what you do is you take a frame. I don't know if I have any pictures of frames handy. You have a
Can you
box.
also touch base on how the honey is produced, not the manufacturing?
Oh, by the bee. Okay, that's great. So bees make millions of visits to flowers, nectar-bearing flowers and plants, and they'll extract small little quantities of nectar that are sweet. And they have what's called a honey stomach. The nectar goes into their stomach. They go back to the hive. They give this nectar to bees that are there waiting for them, who will then go put it into a cell in the part of the hive that is dedicated to honey storage. And that's a whole other thing. But the way we've tried to train bees is we have these boxes, and they also put honey around where they have brood, but we don't want to take that because. So anyway, they'll put this nectar and they'll fill up an individual honeycomb cell, which you've all seen that, it's very small. But then the honey has to, the water content has to be reduced. In order to be legitimately called honey, it has to have roughly 18% water content. If it has more than that, significantly more, it will eventually ferment. And so the bees get the water out by ventilating the hive. And a lot of times you'll see in the late summer, midsummer, you'll see bees out in front of the hive fanning their wings, and they're getting air to go through the hive. And this is part of the reason to cool the hive down and to evaporate the water out of the honey. Once they've judged that the honey is cured and ready, they will put a wax cap over each cell. So you have a completed comb of honey, has all cells capped, and it's hermetically sealed. And what beekeepers do, or honey processors, we take that from them, and then we cut off the cap usually with some kind of knife, and spin the comb around to extract the honey. And then I think a big part, this is just an editorial comment because we've only got like 2 minutes. I think local honey that's produced, and this is a self-serving, that is not heated is better for you and tastes better than honey that is pasteurized and heated to a high temperature in order to kill organisms and keep it so-called shelf life. Actually, honey doesn't need any of that, but it helps to clarify the honey and keep it from granulating, because all honey that has glucose in it will granulate. Tupelo honey doesn't granulate, but I
Is-
think that's the only one that doesn't.
Is honey still sold in the comb? Can you still
Oh,
go
yeah.
and buy honey in a comb?
Yeah, if you go to usually some of the farmers markets, beekeeper
Yeah.
stands by the side of the
I
road.
remember my mother used to buy it that way and we'd put the wax and everything else
Yeah, yeah,
on a piece of toast.
yeah, sort of the original chewing gum, right? So,
Yes.
well, I guess we run out of time, unless there's
Any
one
more
quick
questions? or
quick question.
put your hand up?
I just want to thank you for the chance. Yes.
What we call honeybees, that's a European species.
Yeah, yes, that's often what the European honeybee, yes.
So the honeybees we have in this country were brought here from.
Exactly.
Europe.
And that's something I was going to mention is that honeybees are technically, I hate to call them this, an invasive species. They're a beneficial invasive species. The original, like the 1620s, I think the British English settlers brought over, I think they were called German black bees, and they weren't very well tempered. And but yeah, so bees were brought over early on. People valued the wax, among other things. I mean, some churches only use wax, beeswax for candles because it's of its purity. So anyway, I just wanted to thank you. I don't mean to portray myself as an expert. I've tried to steer you to some experts. Here's some resources for you if you want to continue your study, investigation. At the end, I have some books. Oh, what can you do? Dr. Spivak talked about it. Just plant some pollinator-friendly plants, and then there's some reading. I didn't talk about The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan. That would be a great book to read about our agricultural system, published in 2006. But these are all good books. So. That's a good, I'll have to look that up. I don't know. But I remember that. That's like one of the first things I heard, right?